Nothing else has defined the past generation in Washington, D.C. quite so much as the massive urban redevelopment that has caught fire all over town, dramatically reshaping the city landscape in the process. Yet over the past few years, the largest scale and most conspicuous of all of these projects has been the District Wharf. Conceived by real estate developer P.N. Hoffman, the Wharf began construction in 2014. As Phase 1 was completed last year, a staggering 2 million square feet of space, valued at about $1.2 billion overall, had been established across 12 acres of the waterfront in southwest Washington. Phase 2 begins later this year and will essentially double the size of the Wharf by the time of its scheduled completion in 2022.
It's crazy what's been happening and how it's been changing, and it went from being nothing to now being a whole neighborhood in Washington, D.C., so it's something to be reckoned with.
It's a time of new beginnings, it's a time of transformation for that neighborhood, and there are lots of things to talk about associated with that.
The emergence of the Wharf is perhaps best understood as part of the narrative of all the massive reconstruction that has taken place across the city of Washington over the last few decades. An overview of the state, which America's capital had ascended into by the late 20th century, will underscore why this sort of additional attention and development was so critical to begin with.
It's important when we think about Washington that we're very honest and candid about our history.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a history of racial segregation in the city.
Growing up in Washington, D.C., you would never really drive outside of Northwest Washington, D.C. There was no real reason to venture out to, Southeast D.C., Northeast D.C. There was just a lot of poverty, a lot of crime, and, just not a lot of amenities that would attract people to go there and spend time and money.
We were a city that only 20 years ago was totally bankrupt, with horrendous unemployment and a very deficient amount of capacity within the local government, which is the District of Columbia. So to see the private sector wanting to invest in the city is fundamentally very positive.
In the 90s, under Mayor Anthony Williams, there was the idea, the planning to bring the population back to Washington, D.C. So the goal was 100,000 new residents. And it seemed ludicrous at the time because Washington, D.C. had been losing population since 1950. So if you want to have that greater population, you need a lot of things to come together, as far as development, as far as amenities, as far as just the housing for it.
I think it was just a matter of time before the right leadership came that the city was going to have a resurgence. And that's definitely what happened in the early 2000s.
This newfound ambition of the city council, combined with the private sector's gradual willingness to participate, would soon be visibly manifested in many neighborhoods, including 14th Street, U Street, Columbia Heights, and Gallery Place. However, at first these revitalized regions were disproportionately featured in the Northwest Quadrant, which, for all of its troubles, was still the home to the bulk of the federal government and major cultural destinations in Washington. In time, the city would turn its attention to the other three quadrants, which were badly neglected by comparison, and maybe even without.
Basically, since Washington started growing and becoming more and more predominant, there was less and less space for development to occur in this Northwest Quadrant, so it started to kind of overflow into Northeast, Southeast, Southwest, and the Wharf is really the first piece of that. The land prices in those areas were just really suppressed and really cheap land, honestly. So people saw opportunities to go into these neighborhoods and buy acres at a time. Big developers would buy acres at a time and then really just start planning communities in all of this empty wasteland space that were just grass fields and parking lots and just dirt. So basically the Wharf, being the closest one to the monuments and stuff like that, was kind of like the first one in the pipeline concurrently at the same time as the Nat Stadium, which is only a couple blocks away from the Wharf.
Is Southwest DC such a stranger to urban redevelopment? No, in that in the 1960s, the neighborhood had undergone one of the largest and most controversial urban renewal programs in the city's history. But yes, in the sense that no major-scale redevelopment would take place in Southwest for the rest of the 20th century, and much was left unfulfilled from the initial vision that had sparked this near-total remodeling of the quadrant.
Southwest has gone through a number of different regenerations over the centuries, so it's not unusual. This happens, every century or 50 years.
It's a quadrant of DC that was, badly neglected. It was, frankly, kind of what sounds like destroyed via urban renewal and construction projects that kind of gutted the neighborhood as it once was.
One of the primary intentions of the Wharf is to create a process of incremental change in a part of the city that was anything but incremental. It was totally wiped out and rebuilt all at once. And now this is a first opportunity for the neighborhood to change on an incremental basis.
Modern additions like the arena stage gradually brought Southwest DC some of the mainstream cultural appeal which it has largely gone without for much of its history. Many patches of the quadrant remained underutilized, however, the most obvious of which was the entire Southwest waterfront, which the city government had restricted from residential use and which had never been the site of much commercial activity, notwithstanding the historic fishing market. Given the path which the city had placed itself on, that would all come to change in due course.
Prior to the rezoning of the Wharf, this is something I worked on extensively, there was no housing allowed there at all. So nobody ever has lived on the waterfront in the Southwest.
We had a great fish wharf that contributed not just to our life, but to a big swath of Washington, D.C. life. But, the rest of the Southwest waterfront that was developed in the urban renewal era was just not happening, was very spotty in what was desirable to go there for.
It's several acres that used to be a landfill, a grass field that really wasn't used for anything. And then the DC government decided to put out a proposal for developers to bid on building something on it. And then obviously P.N. Hoffman wanted it's a hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars worth of development.
This vast chunk of land, so close to the National Mall and the heart of DC's tourist economy, proved to be attractive to many private investment firms who bid in great numbers for the right to construct there. In the end, the city selected P.N. Hoffman, who embarked on a project that was meant to redesign this entire area while also giving back to the city in the process.
There's a lot of interest in the site. It was probably the best remaining piece of real estate in Washington, D.C. of this size, where you could build 3 million square feet of mixed-use development. This project it's district-owned land, and it's ground leased from the developers have ground leased it for 99 years. So the district owns the underlying land and continues to benefit from the project.
P.N. Hoffman won approval for the project in 2006, but it would take another 8 years and some 800 community meetings to secure all the necessary permits to allow construction to proceed. During that time, P.N. Hoffman joined forces with their development partner, Madison Marquette, and together, the two teams reached some important consensuses as to what they wanted this project to resemble. One important standard they established was that, pricey though this project may be, it ought not become overly luxurious and out of reach from the general public. Furthermore, when selecting which businesses to include on the waterfront, it was important to distinguish the Wharf from all of the homogeneous retail collectives out there and infuse this new space with important elements of DC's local business culture.
It's important to know that the Wharf has a mixture not just of uses, but also of income levels. And that's part of the vision of creating a place that's accessible to all.
So they're trying to diversify the Wharf a little bit, although everything is really expensive, don't get me wrong. It's more like, well, will cater to someone who's a tier below that, like 5-star, or this will cater to someone who's looking for more of a boutique experience than, your bread and butter 5-star hotel. So they're trying to differentiate to make the absorption process less of a blow on their financials.
I think it was important from us from the beginning to get a group of retailers, restaurateurs. Even the Anthem is a locally owned company, but all of the folks that have occupied our retail space for the most part are non-national, small, unique, local retailers.
One significant gesture in that regard is the inclusion of Politics and Prose. For almost 30 years, this bookstore has thrived at its present location on Connecticut Avenue. To be opening a second store marks a major move both for Politics and Prose as an independent organization and for the Wharf in its attempt to win favor with local residents.
Having an authentic DC character has been achieved gold star by having the Politics and Prose there. That is a Washington, D.C. institution. It's beloved and it's highly, highly valued. And, it's an independent bookstore at a time when there aren't a lot of independent bookstores in Washington.
Politics and Prose, which is one of the rarest things on earth, which is a local, independently owned bookstore. They've all gone the way of the dinosaur, but they're here.
For the Wharf developers, it was attractive to have a business like Politics and Prose that is a known commodity, really respected and beloved in DC. That also will bring in crowds a lot of the time for our events. So per my knowledge, they wanted this development to have a local character. They didn't just want to bring in generic, chain stores that are national. So, they went with us, and we, couldn't be more happy with how it's gone so far.
Around the corner from Politics and Prose stands the Anthem, a $60 million concert venue operated by IMP Productions, who already runs some very popular venues around town, such as the 930 Club. The Wharf represents much the same value for this company as it does for Politics and Prose, a chance to take a beloved Washington, D.C. institution and expand its commercial potential and fan base at a brand new site.
930 Club will always be the 930 Club. It's not going to change, but opening this venue gives us another place to be able to put acts that are big and getting bigger.
And when the developers thought, well, if we're going to open up a 4,200 person venue, they're thinking, well, who are we going to go to? Are we going to go to Joe Schmo, who's never done this before? No, we're going to go to the #1 operator in Washington, D.C., who we know he's done this before, and we know he has all the contacts, and we know he has all the balance sheet and the money to make this whole thing happen.
I think the Anthem has been a big hit with people that I've talked to. It's pretty rewarding to go into a space that 6,000 people are enjoying the music. You can see all the energy and excitement in there. That's been particularly rewarding to see.